Victoria Coates has had an unusual, what's the phrase I'm looking for? American journey, I think is what I want to say. She's an art historian with a doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania, who went on to become the director of research in the personal office of Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. She later became Deputy National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump. In 2019, she was promoted to Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for the Middle East and North Africa, overseeing the maximum pressure campaign against Tehran and initiating the negotiations for the Abraham Accords. She later became a top advisor to Secretary of Energy Dan Brouillette on national security issues and his personal representative for the Middle East and North Africa. At one time, she was also an adjunct fellow here at FDD. At that same time, I believe she was also a consulting curator at the Cleveland Museum of Art. In any case, she is now vice president of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Somehow she's found time to write a new book, The Battle for the Jewish State. Here it is, How Israel and America Can Win. She's with us today in our cozy little studio here at FDD HQ. I'm Cliff May, and you're virtually with us too, here on Foreign Policy. Welcome. It's so good to see you.
Oh, good to see you too, Cliff. Glad to be home.
Yeah, glad to have you home. Listen, because I'm an old newspaper reporter, I usually start with the news. I'm going to make an exception in this case because the news, and I'm particularly talking about, I'm not the first to say this, Gaz-a-Lago, listeners will understand it better if they understand what's in your book, because I think there's a background that's very useful to understand this, what one can do in a podcast. Also, even starting a little bit further back, just because I'm curious, you dedicate your book to your grandfather, U.S. Army Captain Howard Allen Downey, who stormed up Utah Beach in the D-Day invasion to liberate Europe. And I'm just curious, what happened to him after that? He survived the invasion, obviously.
He did survive the invasion, and my mother was exactly 6 months old. She had been born on December 6th of the previous year, and so he knew. He had only seen her once.
Wow.
And he knew that he had this baby, and, you go to Normandy, and you think about what they did, and the bravery.
How old was he then?
He was probably 30 at that point.
Okay.
And, obviously the folks who came in first by plane, and then the ships, but then he was the second wave. So he had to climb over everybody.
Oh my God.
And then he named his anti-aircraft gun after my mother. It was the Baby Ann. And so she was hunting Nazis from a very early age. And, when she turned 75, I actually took her to Jerusalem, for her birthday. And so she was with us. That was the first year that Ambassador Friedman celebrated the first night of Hanukkah with the prime minister. And the two of us, I guess, were the two highest ranking officials to visit the Western Wall with the sitting prime minister, which was sort of a thing. And that was literally the day of my mother's birthday. But her gift from the Israeli government was a maquette of the 3 interceptors of Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow, and has a little plaque on it that says, "Happy birthday, Mrs. Gardner. Air defense has come a long way."
Wow.
And it's her prized possession.
Wow. So tell us a little bit more about what I called your American journey. I mean, why aren't you at some elite university, one that is not dominated by pro-terrorist professors? We may get back to that. Why aren't you explaining to young professional minds why Jackson Pollock and Andy Warhol owe a lot to Rembrandt?
Well, it's interesting. In a way, writing The Battle for the Jewish State it explained that to me, because it has me thinking so much about academia and my academic experience. Yeah. And in hindsight, I wasn't smart enough to realize it as it was happening. But when I made the jump to the Rumsfeld office in 2007, I was increasingly uncomfortable in my surroundings. And I had a really good gig. I was adjunct at Penn. Right. They were supporting my projects. The region, I was a consulting curator at Cleveland, was for the Pompeii exhibition, which Penn supported. Great teaching assignments. And I think I could just feel the turn, where conservatives went from being kind of a quaint oddity to being the enemy
on the university campuses.
on university campuses.
In museums too? I mean, did you feel
I think increasingly.
Yeah.
And then there was the anti-Semitism issue, especially at Penn.
But you're not Jewish, right?
I am not, but
No.
at Penn, it historically had the highest percentage of
of Jewish students. My daughter went there,
and
actually.
And they've been reducing it. Ken Marcus has done some really interesting work on this.
Ken Marcus at Brandeis Foundation, Certificate. But very good. I know Ken a little bit. He's very good. Yeah,
he's great. But I mean, he
was in the education department under Trump, and
But he has tracked how this is. The percentages have gone down.
Well, it's kind of DEI. They're overrepresented. That doesn't look like we don't want so many people from us. Why should we? Yeah, right. Specifically, right. We have to reduce the numbers. So it ends up as a quota system, which is sort of what there was, say, in the 1940s when, when my father was trying to go to college. Although my father was poor. My father was a poor kid from Brooklyn. And he couldn't afford college, but there was City College of New York, but you had to be smart enough to get in. It was very much based on your scores and and all of that.
That seems quite antiquated.
And that's antiquated too. I'm sure that wouldn't be the case now. So then you moved into defense studies and national security and foreign policy. Quite a jump from that. And then tell me about how you chose to write. You're thinking about writing a book here, among all the other things you're doing and all the work you're doing at Heritage. And you decided to do the battle for the Jewish state. Why that? Why did you decide on that theme? I mean, a very Zionist theme, essentially.
It is chosen very specifically. I think the events of October 7th obviously were searing for all of us.
Yeah,
and at Heritage, we have not been particularly active in Middle East studies. We've had a presence, but it hasn't been a focus. But when I came and then Rob Greenway came, it just sort of was a center
you just tell people who Rob Greenway is in a sense.
Rob Greenway is a career Army officer, Green Beret, served with Mike Waltz, actually, which is sort of interesting. And then civilian intelligence officer who was on the NSC with me and was my successor at in the Middle East Directorate as senior director when I went over to the Department of Energy. And he is now the director of our Allison Center for Military Studies and Foreign Policy at Heritage. And because he had spent a career in the Middle East and I've been dabbling in it since Rumsfeld days, it just sort of we started to have kind of a gravitational pull. And after October 7th, set up the National Task Force for Anti-Semitism, which FDD participates in, one of our strongest partners, actually. And we're sort of relaunching that now for 2025 to collaborate with the administration. So, that sort of had us thinking about these issues, but what really struck me was I was getting the same questions from people, which suggested there was kind of a broader befuddlement with what was going on. And so the book has 4 chapters because of the 4 questions. And I was sort of thinking about this. We can get into what they actually are. I am an Encounter Books author, and their gala was in April, and I was speaking to Roger Kimball there, and I said,
"Who runs it? Great guy, very good writer himself.
He's
good
fantastic.
Editor. I know Roger,
very forgiving of me." And I said, "Look, I think I can get this out this year. This is April."
Yeah.
and talking to him and the production team, they're like, "Okay, you got 90 days," and it just kind of came out.
Wow.
To try to speak to the confusion, primarily of Americans, but to anyone who's curious about it, about what happened and how did we get here.
And people should read the whole book because it's granular. There's a lot of history, and it's not a usually long book. I read most of it at an airport.
That was my hope.
Yeah. And they should, forgive me, but I have to. I'm going to cherry pick, some of it. If the essential theme, I guess, if I had to boil it down, but tell me if I'm right, is that the main rationale for U.S. support of Israel is self-interest. Do I have that right?
100%.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you should elaborate on that, on what you're trying to get at here, and why this is not charity. This is not, oh, poor people, we'll save them from another Holocaust. No, this is about America's place in the world.
Absolutely, and it's also not about Christianity, because
Right.
there are a lot of Americans who, love the Holy Land. I mean, I'm a Christian, I love the Holy Land, but that's not my reason for doing this. And I think a lot of Americans rightly ask, why should we be engaged in the Middle East, and why particularly Israel?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's chapter 2. That's one of the questions. The trajectory, I hate to date myself like this, but when I was born, Israel was 20 years old, and Israel's about to have its 77th birthday. And so modern Israel, and
Hmm.
so what it was 50 years ago and what it is now are two radically different things.
Mm.
And the trajectory of the alliance, a lot of which takes place during the Reagan administration, which I found interesting, in terms of establishing the security relationship, the intelligence relationship, missile defense cooperation, and the first free trade agreement the United States had was with Israel under Reagan. So those pillars become what is in the national interests of the United States. It's these three main security buckets, and then the economic, which has turned into tech and biotech and all of these good things that Israel excels at, that the United States does too, and makes Israel the kind of major partner that we have with, say, the UK in Europe or Japan in Asia. It becomes that kind of pivotal relationship that becomes a point for power projection for the United States. And so explaining that, how it came to be was very important to me.
Because, listen, there is within the Trump coalition on the right, there is a group that they would call themselves restrainers. I might call them isolationists, who think that the world is not a place worth involving the U.S. in. Um, yeah, I think that's wrong, because the world is smaller now. It's not a village. I don't believe there's an international community. But I don't think we want a world dominated by our enemies, because that will come back that will have real serious ramifications over time if we let the enemies of the U.S., the enemies of freedom, the enemies of democracy take over. And by the way, I mean, this is kind of very much where FDD is right now. We see this real coalescing of what we call an axis of aggressors. People use other phrases, with Beijing leading, Moscow following, Tehran absolutely hooking their cart to this group, and Pyongyang, which is now involved both with sending munitions to Putin and sending essentially bodies to Putin, and then we see these others who are circling around this axis. South Africa, increasingly Caracas, Havana. I mean, and so you have to, the U.S. has to say, okay, how to respond to this? If you're restrained, might say it doesn't have anything to do with us. Who cares? Europe will take care of itself. Israel can take care of itself. Japan, Taiwan, they can take care of themselves. We don't care. At that point, we become an island in a very, very tumultuous sea with a lot of predators around us, and with AI and with all the other things going on. I think usually dangerous. The other way is to say, listen, American leadership is absolutely essential in the world, and we have to be the most important superpower. And we have to make the rules, because if we don't, our enemies will make the rules and enforce them. I think you're kind of more with me on this than with the restrainers. No?
Well, I think I sort of frustrate both camps.
Okay.
I have a lot of friends in
Yeah.
the restraining camp, and I like listening to their arguments,
Mhm.
because I think it is important,
Yeah.
and I think being judicious about the application of U.S. resources and force is right. But I think, and I agree, they have a presence in the Trump coalition, but as to where the president is, I think with the Gaza discussion, he was showing on a pretty, I know we'll get to that, but in a pretty visceral way, that is American leadership, that it is indispensable in these cases. And my feeling is that these types of relationships with the UK, Japan, Israel, you are reducing the amount that the United States has to do because you are empowering an ally that can do a lot of the heavy lifting themselves. And so that's where I think, the situation in Europe, and we could certainly
Right.
talk about Ukraine if
Yeah.
of interest, but it's where I think the rubber's going to hit the road with NATO is the president is going to need them to do more.
Yeah, I think it's a hugely important point and it should be a point that restrainers are at least open to listening to, in that if we're saying, no, we're not going to do it for these other countries. We want countries that are going to stand up for American values and stand up for American interests, understanding that their interests and values coalesce with ours. And these are good allies because these are force multipliers. We can help them, all kinds of ways we can help them, but they got to do it. We expect them to do it. We expect Japan to be out there in terms of Taiwan. We expect all the Europeans, certainly all the NATO members. Poland is sort of doing a lot more. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Germany. Sorry, I don't think enough. Countries like Belgium and Canada, not enough. I'm sorry. No, we expect you to. We expect you to contribute significantly to the collective security, because it's collective security. It's not America doing this as a service to you. That's where you get to Israel, where Israel is saying, "Hey, we need your help. We need your support. We need moral support. We need, and we'll help you with weapons building. We are creative. We can give you things you want, but we want you to have our back. But we'll fight common enemies." And it should be clear to everybody that those who call themselves jihadists, those who call themselves what we call Islamists, Islamic supremacists, those are common enemies. I mean, there's a reason I was first in Iran in 1979, or last in Iran in 1979 as well.
I was going to say,
I'm not going to go back.
You haven't visited recently.
After the revolution, I'm going to Shiraz for vacation, and Isfahan. But until then, it was death to Israel, but it was death to America. One is easier than the other, but it was absolutely clear to me as a young, wet behind the ears journalist what this revolution was about. It wasn't an Iranian revolution. It was an Islamic revolution. It was anti-American. It was anti-Western. And too many of my colleagues didn't want to see that.
No, I agree. And that's a key thing here. And just to go back to your point about China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, I call them CRINK. I like
the cranks.
CRINK.
CRINK. Oh, CRINK. Okay,
it's the acronym.
I like that.
Yeah, that actually the Taiwanese taught me that one. And I think particularly here at home, the issue we have is, with the possible exception of the North Koreans, all of those countries are active in the Caribbean and increasingly in the Arctic.
And in South America.
Latin America,
yeah. Which Trump has recognized, obviously.
And the Panama Canal situation being case in point, and I suspect they're going to be taking a good hard look at Cuba as well. But it's, that is a domestic danger that we haven't seen. And the degree to which we have been penetrated by, what's come across the southern and the northern border over the last 4 years is a domestic national security issue that we really haven't faced since the early 19th century.
Right. And because, I mean, the Biden administration seemed, what I'm going to say, I'm going to say something I don't really agree with, but and here's what I mean. The Biden administration didn't seem to understand that border security is national security, but I'm afraid it's worse than that. And this gets into a theme in your book.
Yep.
And when I say it's worse than that, I mean, they understood that they were undermining America by saying, we don't have any rights to this land. We are settler colonialists mostly from Europe. If people want to come here, they have every right to do so. Who are we to tell them no? And then if they have the rights to avail themselves of our welfare system, why would we say that they didn't? And if that puts a lot of pressure on people who are earning a salary, well, they just have to bear it, don't they? Because they are settler colonialists at heart. This gets into the argument you make, and I do it about the anti-Americanism within the left. That is, the anti-Israelism is a way to express the anti-Israelism. And because it's possible to bring down Israel and destroy it. I don't think you'd do that without another Holocaust. I don't think there's any peaceful way to do that. With the U.S., you want to do it. It's going to be a more gradual thing where you transform the population and people understand, as the left has been making, the case the left has been making, that we're not an exceptional country, we're not a good country, we're an evil country. We should say we're on this land because we stole it from the indigenous peoples. And over time, they'll transform the U.S. into something very different. And it will not be an America based on the founders and the founding documents. You say it more. You elaborate on this, but I'm sort of summarizing. Do I have it right? And do elaborate yourself in your words.
You do. I mean, and I do take it a step further that the founding documents and founding fathers would be absolutely demonized in this. And so it goes back to the big Satan, little Satan.
Yeah, Trump was right. When it wasn't just the Confederate soldiers and statues. It was going to be Thomas Jefferson any day now. And it was.
Theodore Roosevelt. Everyone you want to care to mention. But this goes back to the little Satan, big Satan thing, because we're both Satan in that.
Yeah.
And little Satan is easier, as you said. You can take out Israel. It'd probably be a murder.
Right.
For the United States, it'll be suicide. And that's what they're trying to set up. And
the suicide of the country, which is the way actually historically most empires, most nations die. It's self-inflicted. It's self-inflicted. I think Ibn Khaldun, the Arab historian, pointed that out in around the 14th century.
So it's not new. But I think what the settler colonialism, there's a good book on this as well recently, that this is uniquely the United States and Israel. And so if they get Israel, they're not stopping there. And it is very much this line of reasoning that these countries are illegitimate and most fundamental, and yes, racist and imperial, but fundamentally they are illegal. And so I went into some of the curricula and, some rather shocking peer-reviewed major journal articles on this topic, laying out why under international law, the foundation of Israel in 1948 was illegal. And as a student in these universities where, the one I highlight in the book comes from something called the Cambridge Core Curriculum. Sounds great. Cambridge University has put their stamp on this. And, so you as a professor would think, well, this, of course, has, been reviewed and this is a major article and I should have this on my syllabus. And then your students read it and all the things they've been taught that are the most bad in this world, imperial, racist, illegal. That is what Israel is. And then by extension, the United States, so that their loathing of Israel and then increasing loathing of their own country is logical in this twisted world. And so I think that is what has been happening really since I left academia, with this increasing sense of just visceral discomfort. And it's permeating all aspects of academic life.
And one thing is that they say, well, this is our interpretation of international law, and it's their interpretation. I mean, it has no logic. But then they also don't believe that international law applies to those they like.
Right.
So if you're Hamas and you're stealing babies and you're raping women, well, that's resistance, and you're not bound by any laws. Well,
not
actually,
even bad manners.
The whole point of the laws of armed conflict is that both sides will agree there are certain things we don't do because it's going to be a brutal process of war, but we can mitigate a little bit the brutality. But they're saying, no, we only want laws to tie the hands of the Israelis, tie the hands of the Americans, in Afghanistan. We don't want the enemies of America and Israel to be bound by any laws. You can interpret it, but that's them making the rules, and I think trying to make a new rules-based order with their rules made in Beijing, Tehran, Moscow, places like that. Very dangerous. Another reason we don't want that to happen. Now, one thing I didn't understand until I read your book was the role of DEI. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why didn't I understand it? Because I thought, I hate DEI. DEI is terrible. I'm glad Trump is getting rid of it in the military, other places. But I saw it as a more domestic thing. Okay, it means things like we have too many Jewish students at University of Pennsylvania. We got to get rid of some. We've got to get we want more trans students here. We don't care whether they have good marks from high school or bad. We're going to bring them in because it's diversity, and diversity is our strength. Maybe explain to someone like me who doesn't understand now, but didn't, why DEI also, and I guess wokeism and critical theory all also have an impact on foreign policy and national security.
Well, and in a way, it's mostly the critical race theory, but these sort of insidious ideologies, I guess is the best word for them, which promote a very, very extreme progressive agenda, have permeated the academy and become central to the way scholarship works. And if you want to take it back to art history, it becomes the sort of fulcrum by which they have jettisoned masters. And so your
the word,
right?
Yeah.
So your Michelangelos and Leonardos of the world are white European males,
right?
Now, if you want to talk about them in terms of queer theory, okay. But if you're not talking about them in terms of queer theory, then no. Like the Mona Lisa has to be a self-portrait in drag. That kind of thing. And, the homoeroticism of the David, that is okay. But if you want to talk about the fact, and I'm writing a book about this right now, which is why I'm going down this rabbit hole. But
no, it's very interesting.
You talk about the fact that Michelangelo's David and Leonardo's Mona Lisa were made in the same place at the same time. 1503, Florence, small town.
Yeah.
The two most iconic works in the Western canon, by two men who hated each other, hated each other. But they have shaped artistic identity in the West in a very visceral way that you can't talk about that, because that would suggest that they are excellent and they are better than anything else. And that is where they are undermining everything we hold most dear. And it is systematic as they go through the canon of the West, and it's not enough to build up other traditions and say there were great, Islamic philosophers and Islamic artists or Chinese philosophers.
I just quoted Ibn Khaldun.
You did. That brought it to mind. But it's not just saying these are also great traditions. Yeah. It's saying this tradition is uniquely corrupt and should be stamped out, literally stamped out.
Yeah.
And it's why the climate activists throw soup on the Mona Lisa.
Right. Oh, right. I didn't quite understand that. Yeah.
Well, the soup part still hasn't been explained to me, but the attacks on artworks have just skyrocketed over the last 5 years.
Right. It's one of their preferred forms of protest is great ancient art, but it's Western art they're doing. Right. They're not doing it at the at statues at the African Museum or anything like that. They're going to because it's so specifically anti-Western. Now, after October 7th, at first it seemed to me that President Biden, who was an older guy, thought, okay, this is reminiscent of the Holocaust and what the Nazis did, and this can't stand, and I'm going to support the Israelis. And then it seems to me, I'm speculating here, that he got dragged back by all the woke, progressive leftists in his administration and became, at the very best, equivocal in terms of support for Israel. And you critique that, if I remember, in the book, but you do that a little bit about what the Biden-Harris administration did by insisting on restraint and ceasefire and no escalation.
Peers.
Yeah.
A peer to Gaza.
Yeah, the peer to Gaza. Okay, well, yeah.
Chef Jose.
Well, and that the idea that Israel, in the midst of a war, while innocent hostages are seen ahead, had as its primary responsibility to feed and provide humanitarian assistance to the enemy it was fighting, without recognizing the fact that who is going to get that food when it gets in? Hamas is going to take it. They're going to profit from it. They're going to resell it. They're going to use it for their own uses. We're even sending fuel in so they have fuel. And not to recognize, it can't be done that way. No wars have been fought that way, but we're going to make them fight their war that way.
No, it was crazy. And I think, I don't want to be too cynical about this, but we had the campus protests erupt within days.
Within days of
It was
before the
less than
Israelis had invaded, way before.
hadn't done a thing. And everybody might have noticed we had a presidential election in November. So this time a year ago, we were going into an election year.
Right.
And there was a lot of talk over the course of the year about the importance of some particular districts in Michigan and the Arab American vote, which was an issue for them, but it wasn't existential.
Right.
What was existential was the youth vote.
The youth vote.
Yeah, so 18 to 29, that demographic is what elected Joe Biden. And it's what tampered down the red wave in 2022.
Uh-huh.
And if you look at particularly ADL polling on anti-Semitism, when they started 50 years ago, older Americans tended to be more anti-Semitic and younger tended to be less. And so then you had a problem that would just solve itself. Now we have the reverse, that older Americans by about 25 points tend to be less anti-Semitic. And it tends to be 50-50 in the youth vote. The Democrats can't afford to lose 50% of the youth vote because that's countrywide. That for them is losing the election. So President Biden's, and I do give him credit for this in the book, his initial impulses were correct. His trip to Israel was courageous. Many of the things he said there were helpful, but then they start to equivocate. And you have, Kamala Harris being much to the left of the president on this issue, much harder on the Israelis, much more accommodating to the Palestinians, excusing what they did. And what they wound up doing then, though, was pleasing no one. And I think President Trump, who had a much clearer position on this, that we stand with Israel, Israel is our great ally, he, would have no problem before October 7th seeing the Palestinians negotiate for themselves. He expected them to, but his position was clear. And the irony of that was a lot of young people did not vote in this election because they were turned off by both sides. A number of Arab Americans voted for Trump because they knew where he stood. And they thought he might promise a better future for them. So, that was, I think, a political reality that somebody in the White House woke up to in January of 2024 and said, Houston, we have a problem. We cannot lose the 18 to 29-year-olds. And,
and
that drove policy.
Right. And that vote, that 18 to 29 vote, again, they had been indoctrinated at the universities, as you earlier described, so that they saw the world in this kind of neo-Marxist, through a neo-Marxist prism of oppressors and oppressed. And entirely. And Palestinians, because somehow they're thought of as people of color, though they're not necessarily, and Israelis often are. As a young reporter, one of the things I did was to go to northern Ethiopia and meet with the Ethiopian Jews, then called the Falashas. It's not a great name, but that's what people know them, just as they were walking out to Sudan. Because in Sudan, they were going to get picked up by the Israelis and flown to Israel. And that was an amazing thing in this very, African bush is what you see.
You feel like it's the lost tribe.
It was. I think that's what it was. I think that's who they are. Anyhow, but but they see it through this and it is a neo-Marxist lens, and so they have to say, free Palestine, and the Israelis are settler colonials, and that's such an odd thing. Yes, America was settled, and we had colonies here, absolutely. But when you're talking about Jews in Judea, the land of the Jews, they're not actually settler colonialists. And Jews were thrown out at various times by the Romans. They were slaughtered. They were enslaved. Jews always managed to stay. In 1850, population of Jerusalem was majority Jewish. Hebron had a Jewish population. When Judea and Samaria was taken over militarily and occupied by the Jordanian army with a lot of British officers, and it was Judea and Samaria. The Jews were ethnically cleansed, and then the Jordanians renamed it the West Bank.
Hey, voila.
Voila, it's the West Bank, and a Jew there is somehow a settler. Anyhow, I'm going on a little bit, but what I'm saying is that this neo-Marxist prism of oppressors and settler colonialists actually doesn't applies in a lot of places. It doesn't really apply very well in Israel and the other territories.
But you're bringing logic and history to
and
the argument.
How unfair!
It is.
How unfair of me.
It's impressive of you, Cliff.
I've got all these in your book. I've got all these bookmarks, all of which we could talk about. But I want to get into the news. But I'm going to ask you, what other points you want to just tease, which is all you can do, really, at this point. So rather than I go through all of those.
There are a couple. I mean, I think the Albert Einstein story, which I'd kind of known, but not really. That he had been this celebrity scientist and physicist in Germany in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Nobel Prizes, theory of relativity, all these good things, which I certainly, as an art historian, do not understand, but appreciate it. And then was increasingly persecuted in German academia. That the Nazis couldn't quite figure out what they thought of him. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, they said that he stole all of his work from actual Aryans, and on the other, they argued that all Jewish science was subjective and therefore not real science. But he finally saw the writing of the wall and escaped in a dramatic fashion through Belgium to England and then the United States. But when he gets here and settles at Princeton, he writes this very famous letter about how anti-Semitism is present in American academia before the Second World War, and that American Jews were going to fall into the same trap European Jews had, that their work would redeem them, that they would assimilate, that the hatred would stop. And unfortunately, I think he was right. And I think that it was largely eradicated from the rest of the country, but it festered in academia and pockets of academia. And that's what leapt out, proud of itself. After October 7th.
Yeah, you say in your book, I may be quoting you, I may be paraphrasing.
You might improve me.
That the reaction after October 7th didn't generate anti-Semitism, it revealed it. It was, the maggots were under that rock all along.
And it's as if they were waiting for a sign. And now we jump into action. And that's what I think has been kind of gobsmacking to a lot of Americans, who didn't realize it was lurking under the rock.
Right.
But when you go back and trace it. And I think the other thing I just mentioned quickly is I spend a lot of time in the 3rd chapter answering the question of what are the alternatives to Israel. And there are two.
Yeah.
The Iranians and the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And you can go through the history of unproductive engagements. The world is intensely sympathetic to the Palestinians. And in that sympathy, which I think is well-meaning, but it's a road to hell, they have tried to make them into something they are not, which is a nation state. And they're not. And you look at the last 50 years, what they've done and what Israel has done, we're not even talking apples and oranges. We're talking, windmills and sharks. It's totally different.
So this raises something that I'm thinking about, haven't written about, but in a certain way, if you want to look at a Palestinian nation state, or at least a proto-nation state, it was Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking for more research on this, and we'll ask our researchers here to do. But because the media couldn't report honestly from Gaza. Now, that mostly meant they couldn't say, oh, yes, I saw Hamas launching rockets from next to this hospital, which meant the hospital was going to be hit, whatever. But it also meant they couldn't say, oh, there's a very nice shopping mall. There are villas with pools that the elites have. There's a very good library in Gaza City. There are all the things that the Gaza mayor wrote about, by the way, in an op-ed in the New York Times about how wonderful Gaza City was. And if you see pictures of it now, which we didn't see then, you see, again, but here's the thing. It was, as a proto-nation state, it was very much a privileged ward of the international donor community. Money poured in there, and the UN provided social services, and other Muslim countries set up hospitals. In a lot of ways, it appears to have been nicer than a lot of Arab cities you can see around the world. I'm sure there was poor people, Of course, 17,000 a day on October 6th were going to Israel to take jobs at higher salaries. And Israel said, we'll double the number as long as we don't have a tax from you. That's all we want. And I also think, this is a little bit more speculative, that Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed's his brother, who probably saw this and in a certain way was turned off by it. Look at the success we're having here. Look at how fat and happy people are. Look at how complacent. I can't leave it like this. I have to start a war that either ends up destroying Israel or at least destroys Gaza. These people who are living well here, they need to be martyrs for the revolution. They need to be martyrs for the jihad. They need to be martyrs for the extermination of Israel. And I'm going to make them that. And he knew that the international community, so-called, wouldn't really say, oh, how terrible that he is going into these billion-dollar tunnels to hide himself and his warriors and leaving women and children out there as human shields. They'd say, oh, no, this is all Israel's fault.
Well, they for sure would say that's all Israel's fault. I might take a slightly different view on, again, I don't want to be too jaded here, but the Palestinian people. I mean, one of the things I learned about a visit this summer when we did go down south to Kfar Aza, where I actually went in the spring of 2018 with Heather Nauert and saw it when it was alive. So seeing it when it was
a kibbutz in the south
that
with
was
Heather, and who I've known for years, who was at Fox and then became a spokesman of the State Department. Wonderful woman.
So and when we realized Kfar Aza had been one of the places, we both wrote about it and referenced each other in that. But one of the things I learned was that the first wave out of Gaza were Hamas.
Right.
The second wave was PIJ, was Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And third wave were normal Palestinians who just picked up meat cleavers, knives, pistols, whatever, and went and participated. And some of them took multiple trips and raped and looted and killed. And they were willing participants. So I think what Sinwar knew is that he had in his population, the vast majority of them, and this is why the Egyptians won't take the women and children. They'll say, oh, we can't displace the poor Palestinians. No, they don't want them. They know who they are and what they have become in this indoctrination regimen under UNRWA, under the UN schools, financed by the United States. This is a population of radicals. It is hard to make that many people be that vicious simultaneously. I mean, you have to work at it from an early age to get that kind of coherent behavior, that aberrant, that inhuman. Yeah. So I think he knew he had that. And that in the fat, happy circumstances, it was dissatisfied. He had to feed that monster more than he had to. The monster was already there.
Yeah.
He didn't have to create it. He had to feed it.
No, that makes all right. That segue is really good into. We're recording this on Wednesday. Should release on Thursday. On Tuesday, President Trump said a number of things that were not on my bingo card.
It wasn't on my bingo card for last night. I will agree with that.
And it talked about the possibility of what people are saying now, creating a Mar-a-Lago. The idea that, okay, we're going to take over, the population needs to go to other places. We're going to clear the bombs, we're going to clear the rubble, and we'll build something very nice for the people to come back to. All right, give me your interpretation of this, because I'll be honest, I'm still pondering and puzzling. My editor at the Washington Times said, what do you think about all this? I said, I'll be ready to opine by next Tuesday for my column. I'm not ready today.
Right. I'm going to need a couple hours. Well, I think I was one of the few that wasn't surprised, because this was something the president talked about a lot. Gaza is a very special piece of land. It's oddly the sunniest place on earth.
Is that so?
It is. The sun's rays strike it in a very particular way, and the ancient Egyptians knew it. And if you look at some of the Akhenaten era art, where you have these hands reaching down, sort of that are the rays of the sun, they knew this was the case for Sinai. Mediterranean in a beautiful area, and
Club Med Mohammed.
Well, and this is
Geo.
This is the way President Trump thinks. He's a real estate guy. He has a developer's eye. And he has had a significant talent for picking these places, be it in Scotland, be it in
Hmm.
New Jersey, be it in Florida. That is, in a way, his inherent talent that has allowed him to thrive. And so he always spoke about Gaza that way with great frustration. And then the year I spent working with Jason Greenblatt and Jared Kushner
Yeah.
on the so-called deal of the century,
Yeah.
that was a good faith offer.
Yeah.
And it had a lot of work put into it in terms of what was going to be, what could be done structurally for Gaza. And there are lots of institutions that can pour lots of money into these things. And many people have labored to say to the Gazans, look, we can develop Gaza Marine, which is their natural gas resources. We can do this desalinization plant so you can have more fresh water. We can run a major electric line. It's called the 161, if you wish to know. I feel like I could lay it myself at this point. But it's, all of that work was legitimate, went into it, could still be done. And so I think for President Trump, who's looks naturally for ways to disrupt intractable problems,
Yeah.
to take a new approach, this came naturally.
So let me float this theory and tell me if you think it's credible or not. He often, and I think rightly so, starts with a negotiating position and then can move from it rather than doing what too many American diplomats have done over the years, which is say, all right, let's figure out what's fair among ourselves. That'll be our negotiating position. And then you get pushed back from there, right? So he's saying to Jordan, he's saying to Egypt, you should be taking Egypt, particularly, you got the whole Sinai. Israel gave it back to you in exchange for a very cold peace. Israel's helped you can retain the Sinai when you've had various jihadis there, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Now you have to be, at least you can put up some tent cities to get people who have no homes or whose homes have been destroyed. Why they've been destroyed? Because a war was launched against Israel, because there were IEDs in all those homes, because all because of Hamas. Not Israel responded, didn't start this. You can be helpful to these populations, and the Egyptians and Jordanians saying, no, we're not going to be helpful. So in a way, he's saying to them, you don't want to be helpful? Okay, I can do this myself. But let me tell you how I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to do it myself in this way. I'm, fine. You don't want to participate? Don't participate. But let me tell you. And by the way, that also means the reconstruction. Turkish companies are not going to get the funds from that. Egyptian companies, they're not going to get the funds for that. If I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. It's totally mine. And I think he would also probably follow up with repercussions in terms of, what do you think you're entitled to from me if you are not an ally helping me solve a problem you want me to solve and that you say you want solved, but I'm suspicious that what you really want are for Palestinians to remain what they have been for generations, sacrificial pawns to be used only to exterminate Israelis. And I'm not interested in that particular project.
Well, and you could take that another step and
Okay.
say, I'm also not interested in being the lead donor to your country.
Right.
Because
Yeah,
both
right,
Jordan
right.
and Egypt are major recipients of U.S. foreign aid, not just security aid, although that is a significant piece, but also the kind of foreign aid that the president is righteously snuffing out at USAID this week.
Yeah.
But, at the same time, I think, the chorus of folks who have been saying, what's next? What's the day after in Gaza are the same folks who are now horrified by what President Trump proposed for Gaza, which is essentially a real estate development deal. And which I find somewhat amusing because, like, okay, you've all been demanding a plan. Well, somebody stood up last night and said, here's a plan. And instead of saying your plan is, illegal, immoral, and unjust, why don't you come up with your own plan then? And if you can't come up with your own plan, perhaps you'd better start working with this plan. And so I think, the expectation would be that Jordan and Egypt are going to have to get to yes, because ultimately there's tremendous American leverage over them. And then, the additional step there is the United States actually really shouldn't pay for this. And there is a lot of money in the Gulf, which is sometimes a bad thing, but in this case is a good thing. And that money can be deployed here. And our mutual friend, Ron Dermer, has been spending a lot of time talking to all of the Gulf nations about this, which I think, can be a bridge for them to play a constructive role here. They have been reluctant, but I think President Trump is going to say to them, "Oh, you pledge this deathless commitment to the Palestinian cause. Okay, then this is what you're going to do." And we'll see how it transpires. I agree. He will start from a maximalist position, and then
See what
what's
else?
possible. Yeah,
Put something else on the table if you don't like it. Right. That's the way one should negotiate. Actually,
and it's worked pretty well over the course of the last 2 weeks with our Canadian and Mexican friends,
and with Colombia
and Colombia. Yeah, go down the list. Panama.
Yeah.
So it's that is not out of character, but the one thing it has reminded me of very much is the embassy move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Every president promised that. No, but you can't actually do that. He said, "Why not? I'll do it."
Well, and that's the thing is we got the same arguments that they're using now for the Gaza plan, which is the Arabs will be forced to attack Israel if you do this, and the streets will run with blood and the sky will fall. And what's more, Israel really doesn't want this. I've already started to hear this. They might say they want this, but they really don't want this. Well, anybody who tells you the Israelis don't want a strong U.S. presence and support is out of their minds. So it's the same thing with the embassy move. They were ready for it, when in 2018. And so I think, if this is what the Trump administration decides to pursue, they'll be ready for it. And the Arabs might surprise us in their response.
Right. And in terms of the Gulf nations, there's a distinction I just want to make clear, and that's there are the Gulf nations who are part of the Abraham Accords that you worked on, Bahrain, UAE. Qatar is a different story. And I misunderstood this, I think. The Qataris spent a lot of money building in Gaza. And I kind of thought, I think the Israelis did, okay, if they're putting up all these buildings and structure, they're not going to want to see them rubbled. So they have an interest in peaceful coexistence, or at least not having hostilities. And
the Qataris.
The Qataris. And and I think Americans thought, I think a lot of Americans still do, that the Qataris are hosting Hamas leaders, so they have influence over those leaders. Now, my belief is that what the Biden administration should have said on October 7th, October 8th to the Qataris is, you tell the Hamas leaders that they give up the hostages, the Americans for sure, but give them all up. And if they don't, they're leaving their hotel rooms in handcuffs, and they're either going to be in Qatari prisons or they're going to be extradited to the U.S. for kidnapping Americans.
Oh, Guantanamo, yeah.
Or Guantanamo, that's fine. I have good reasons for that. And that was not the way they've been treated. Now, I think the Qataris, and I think Al Jazeera, which is their propaganda platform, I just think all of that is much more nefarious than a lot of people understand, and that needs to be dealt with. There's some question about what role they can or should play in terms of any reconstruction of Gaza, because because they're to blame, but also their motives are bad, because they're just going to rebuild Gaza so it can do on another October 7th, 5 years down the road. That's not particularly helpful, because that'll mean the Israelis will have to rubble Gaza again in response. That's not a good day after plan.
Well, for sure we don't want that. I think I may take a slightly different view on this, in that I am agnostic on the Gulf.
Mm-hmm.
During the rift, which took place when I was on the NSC staff,
the rift between
UAE and Saudi primarily, and
Qatar on the other side. You're right. This was during Tillerson, was it then?
Yeah, it was June of 2017. It was right after the president's trip.
Right.
And the Saudis and Emiratis declared a blockade on Qatar.
Yeah, I remember
if you look at the map of the Gulf, Qatar is like a little appendix on the Saudi peninsula. And we faced a decision. Are we going to choose a side? The decision was made very much by the president that we were not going to choose a side, that we need all of them.
Okay.
And, I don't want to belabor this. Everybody has their faults. And, if you decide one side is the angel and the other side is the devil, you're going to miss a lot
Mm-hmm.
because angels and devils are actually pretty rare.
Mm-hmm.
They do exist, but they're rare. And, when I look at Qatar, the president has a very personal, strong relationship with the emir. That is real. And it is unlikely to be going anywhere. And there are three factors that make that a country I am strategically interested in. One is Al Udeid, our air base.
Right, we have an air base there.
Now
right?
you could move it.
You could move it.
They have invested.
Can move it to Gaza.
It could go to Gaza. Yeah,
I've had that suggestion made to me by
I
one of my.
I was going to say that has already come up today, but if you do, bear in mind that they've invested whatever it is, $13 billion in it. They've got another $7 billion. We don't have allies that do that for us routinely, and that is a big deal. The second is that QIA, their sovereign wealth fund, while already the largest per capita, will be the largest by gross sum by the end of the decade, in the service of 3 million people. That is unique in world history.
By the way, when you say 3 million people, only 1/10 of those
are
actually hold
Qatar,
citizenship right in the country. The rest are servants.
Indeed, but I mean that makes it even more dramatic.
Yeah, no, okay, fair enough.
And so that then becomes a national security asset for the state, and how that is deployed is going to be fascinating.
Yeah,
and I would like to discuss that. The third piece is they are technically, although I would question this, and we haven't seen the most recent numbers, the third largest exporter of natural gas behind Russia and the United States. Their projection is they will be the largest by the end of the decade. And I always say, well, unless we get our act together, which under my friend Secretary Chris Wright, which I love saying, I think, and Secretary Doug Burgum, I think we are likely to give them a run for their money. But again, that is literally the fuel of the next quarter century.
Yes.
And how
not sun power, not solar power, not wind power, just so people know. You can't do what you need.
Sadly,
can't do it.
We're not going to be burning peat. And, that again, given the energy demands the world is going to be facing, is critical. So I am not glossing over Al Jazeera. I understand. Trust me.
Yeah.
The reality of that institution, we've all seen it exposed in Gaza, but there are reasons they have a role to play. And they would argue that the reason the Hamas leadership was there was because Barack Obama asked them to host it.
I believe that.
And that the Biden people asked them not to expel them. And you can certainly debate the wisdom of that.
Right.
And you can debate the wisdom of accepting the Biden demands.
Right.
They could have just expelled them.
Right.
I probably would have, but, who knows how that election was going to go. So it's just, in my take on the Gulf in particular, it is not black and white. So
there are complexities there. And I think you're fair to raise them. All right. Victoria, this has been fascinating, edifying. And your book is absolutely, I'm just telling you, a must read. Again, you get through it quick and easy, but there's so much information, so many good ideas. But thanks for writing it.
That means the world to me. I really am thrilled to have that assessment. And I would just draw folks' attention to the cover. This was kind of fun. I really wanted to use this picture.
Oh, yeah.
The specific picture of the Iron Dome, the interceptors preparing to intercept the rockets from Gaza, because that was done deliberately by the designer of the Iron Dome.
Really?
They wanted those trails, and they saw a great beauty in them.
Wow.
And so we actually had to pay for that photograph. And I did an interview over the weekend with the Israel-based correspondent for NPR. And he told me that specific picture had been taken by one of their crew.
Oh, no kidding.
And because he said, we actually looked at the book because we were going to see if you had pirated it. But no, we paid and had the proper attribution. So the guy who took the picture is very, very aware of it. But it's a very kind of haunting visual of this conflict, but then also of the extraordinary success of the Iron Dome. And it's been fun that President Trump has been talking about an Iron Dome for the United States. as shorthand for a comprehensive missile defense program.
Comprehensive layered missile defense. So they
Very
read
cool.
because we're very, very cool. I'm glad you called my attention to that. I didn't.
And I guess the last thing on the cover
Yeah.
I'd draw your attention to is, as my old boss, Senator Ted Cruz, wrote the introduction.
He wrote a very good introduction. I know I underline things. I underline everything. The objective of Israel's enemies is not just the elimination of the Jewish state, but also Western civilization led by America writ large. It's kind of your theme right there in one sentence. And October 7th, the crisis was exposed, not generated on that day. Oh, I think I was paraphrasing him on that. Anyhow, yeah.
He's a senator. I'm not.
He's, very, was the NPR interview fair? Was it a good interview?
It was a good interview.
It was okay?
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm happy to do NPR, BBC,
oh, you should be, but I have
CNN,
trouble, with NPR.
They have their views. I have mine.
Well, that's right, but they're funded by American taxpayers.
Hopefully
that's
not
a whole other, Hopefully not for long. Again, thank you again, Victoria.
My pleasure, Colin.
My pleasure to see you. Thanks to all of you who have been with us for this conversation here today on Foreign Policy.